Cameras flickered to life, flooding the Congressional hearing room with an uneasy glow. It was supposed to be just another day of debate in Washington, but the air carried something heavier, that quiet, invisible electricity before a storm. Reporters adjusted their lenses, aides shuffled papers, and the murmurs faded as the two women everyone had come to see took their places. Nancy Mace leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the moment would unfold. Her expression was deliberate, a mix of composure and calculation, the kind of calm that hides provocation behind a smile. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, her hands resting still on the table, her posture poised and unbothered. She didn't need to speak to command attention. Her presence alone was enough to shift the focus of the room. It wasn't just politics now. It was something deeper, something personal. Two women from different worlds, both strong, both unafraid, standing in the same spotlight but holding different truths. Every sound in the room felt amplified. The creak of a chair, the click of a pen, the faint whisper of cameras focusing in. 1,000 eyes watched, not for policy or law, but for human confrontation, the kind that reveals character more than words ever could. Mace glanced up, her lips curving into a faint smirk, as if to signal that she was ready to spar. Crockett didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, her silence louder than any opening statement. Between them stretched an invisible tension, not hostility, but challenge. One questioned authority through intellect. The other defended it through conviction. They weren't enemies. They were reflections of two ways women have learned to survive in rooms built to silence them. For a brief second, time slowed. The noise faded, leaving only the rhythmic sound of breathing and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Crockett exhaled quietly, eyes unwavering. Mace's smirk deepened. Confident, maybe too confident. The audience sensed it too. Something was coming. Not a shouting match, not chaos, but clarity. This wasn't about ego. It was about power. How it's earned, how it's used, and how easily it's dismissed when it doesn't come wrapped in the right tone. The narrator's voice would later describe it best. It wasn't just another political moment. It was a mirror, reflecting not who spoke louder, but who refused to bow. Nancy Mace shifted forward in her seat, the corners of her mouth tugging into a smile that wasn't entirely friendly. The kind of smile politicians wear when they know they're being watched. Part charm, part challenge. Her voice carried across the room, smooth but edged with sarcasm. She began her remarks not with data or discussion, but with tone. It was subtle at first. A light jab about professionalism, a question about composure, but everyone could feel the undercurrent. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about control. She tilted her head, pretending curiosity, yet every word dripped with condescension. Maybe, she said lightly, if you'd taken time to review the report instead of reacting to it, you'd understand it a bit better. The remark landed like a pebble in still water, quiet but deliberate, rippling through the chamber. A few smirks flickered in the audience. Some of her colleagues chuckled softly, quick to hide their amusement behind their hands. The camera panned to Jasmine Crockett. No movement, no expression. Just stillness. That kind of self-control that says I heard you, but I won't let you see me flinch. Yet everyone knew she heard every syllable. The weight of Mace's words wasn't in what she said, but how she said it. The tone that carried years of coded dismissal women of color in politics know all too well. It wasn't overt hostility. It was the weaponization of civility, Mace continued, her words carefully measured. I think sometimes we forget, she said, that passion doesn't always make us right. It's important to stay grounded in facts, not feelings. The statement was designed to sound wise, diplomatic, but it had a sharpness buried inside it, the kind meant to belittle without looking cruel. It was a masterclass in political mockery, calm on the surface, cutting underneath. Crockett's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Steady, focused, quietly taking notes not on paper, but in memory. Around her, the atmosphere shifted. The murmurs grew louder. Staffers exchanged uneasy glances. The audience sensed that something fragile was being tested, the boundary between confidence and disrespect. Mace leaned back again, folding her arms as though she'd just delivered a lesson. The confidence in her posture said she believed she had won the room, that her subtle jabs had landed perfectly. She even threw a small laugh into the air, pretending to break the tension she had created herself. The performance was polished, a politician's instinct to disguise ridicule as reason, but the quiet that followed wasn't admiration. It was discomfort. There was something unsettling about watching mockery wrapped in manners. The laughter from her allies faded when they realized Crockett still hadn't moved. No anger, no defensiveness, just quiet strength. The camera caught Mace glancing up again, this time unsure whether to continue or stop. She added another comment, lighter this time, almost teasing. I mean, I get it. Politics can be emotional, but we have to keep our cool, right? It was bait, clever bait, and everyone knew it. But Crockett didn't take it. Her silence grew heavier, more deliberate, like a storm quietly forming miles away. From the corner of the room, a journalist whispered, "She's pushing too far." Another replied softly, "No, she's giving her just enough rope." What made the moment powerful wasn't the insult itself, but what lingered after it, the expectation. Everyone waited for Crockett to break character, to lash out, to give them the viral clip they came for, but she didn't. Instead, her stillness began to feel like defiance. Every second she stayed silent, she was reclaiming the power Mace thought she could take with mockery. If there was ever a visual metaphor for political restraint, it was right there. Two women seated under blinding lights, one trying to dominate the space with arrogance, the other mastering it with composure. The narrator's voice would later echo the tone perfectly. She didn't raise her voice to match the insult. She let silence speak louder than sarcasm, because sometimes the calmest person in the room isn't losing. She's loading. That was the beauty of it, the quiet before Crockett's reply. The kind of calm that doesn't signal surrender, but strategy. The kind of calm that made everyone in that room, and everyone watching at home, realize that Nancy Mace might have started the conversation, but she wouldn't be the one to finish it. The laughter had faded. The smirks that once flickered across a few faces were now replaced by uncertainty. The air inside the hearing room had grown thick, too quiet, too charged. Every second of silence felt deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett hadn't said a word yet, but her stillness spoke volumes. Her hands were folded neatly on the desk before her, her eyes fixed straight ahead, calm, collected, and unblinking. It was a kind of composure that made even her critics uncomfortable. The more Nancy Mace waited for a reaction, the more her confidence began to look performative. Across the table, Mace adjusted her papers, pretending not to notice the shift in energy. She glanced down at her notes, then back up again, as though expecting the verbal counterpunch that never came. But Crockett wasn't rushing. She wasn't reacting. She was studying, not Mace's words, but her rhythm, her tone, her confidence. She was calculating where to strike and how deep the truth should cut. The camera zoomed in, catching every detail of the moment. The subtle twitch in Mace's jaw, the slow exhale from Crockett's nose, the faint tremor of an aide's pen tapping nervously in the background. There was no shouting, no chaos, just anticipation. Everyone could feel it building, quiet and steady, like the tightening of a bowstring before release. A journalist in the press gallery whispered, "She's waiting her turn." Another responded softly, "No, she's choosing her battlefield." It was true. Crockett's silence wasn't avoidance. It was control. In a political world where everyone rushed to speak, she was showing restraint, the rare kind that disarms more effectively than anger ever could. The tension in the room wasn't just about what had been said, but about what hadn't been. The quiet itself had become a weapon. Mace cleared her throat. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the pressure she pretended not to feel. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "I hope we can keep this civil." The words were an attempt to reclaim control, to position herself as the voice of reason. But her tone wavered just enough to reveal a hint of doubt. Crockett's eyes shifted, slow, deliberate, steady. She met Mace's gaze without flinching. The exchange lasted only seconds, but in that brief lock of eyes, the balance of power visibly changed. Mace's confidence faltered. The smirk she wore earlier began to look forced, the kind that hides unease behind habit. The camera captured the moment perfectly. The two women, locked in silence, surrounded by flashing lights and restless observers, yet entirely alone in their confrontation. It wasn't rage. It wasn't chaos. It was something far more dangerous. Clarity. Crockett glanced down, adjusting a paper that didn't need adjusting. A small, almost invisible act, but intentional. She was grounding herself, centering her thoughts, sharpening her words before the storm. Her breathing slowed. Her face remained unreadable. She wasn't preparing to shout. She was preparing to cut. The narrator's voice would later describe it this way. In that silence, she wasn't quiet. She was sharpening her truth. Every political debate has a rhythm. Accusation, rebuttal, escalation. But this one was different. Mace had taken her shot, expecting the usual chaos that follows when tempers flare. What she didn't anticipate was being met with stillness. That kind of calm unnerves people, especially those who rely on dominance to win. The silence wasn't submission. It was psychological chess. In the audience, even those who sided with Mace felt the shift. The room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the woman who hadn't spoken yet. Crockett finally leaned back in her chair, just slightly. A subtle change in posture that looked effortless, but carried weight. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers stopped fidgeting. She was ready. Mace tried to fill the silence again, speaking just to reclaim control. "I'm sure you have something to say, Congresswoman," she added with forced politeness. Crockett didn't answer. She let the words hang, ignored, irrelevant. The audience caught it immediately, that quiet refusal to engage on command. The kind of silence that doesn't yield, but judges. Someone in the back whispered, "She's not losing control. She's making her wait." And that's exactly what she was doing. Every second of silence was a mirror, reflecting Mace's mockery back at her, stripping it of its power. The arrogance that once filled the room now seemed hollow, like a performance running out of script. When Crockett finally blinked, it wasn't exhaustion. It was preparation. The pause was over. The calculation was complete. The calm had done its job. There was a certain poetry to it. Two women representing two sides of strength. One loud, the other quiet. One reactive, the other reflective. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't the clash of voices, but the discipline of silence. It was the kind of silence that commands attention without demanding it. The kind that turns an insult into anticipation. And in that fragile stillness, just before Crockett opened her mouth to speak, every person in the room, from the reporters to the lawmakers, realized something profound. They weren't about to witness an argument. They were about to witness a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett finally moved. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no sudden outburst. Just a slow, deliberate exhale as she leaned forward. The microphones caught the sound, that small human breath before something real begins. For the first time since Nancy Mace's mockery, Crockett's fingers touched the edge of her notepad. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't need to. Everything she was about to say had already been written in the quiet between insults. Her tone, when it came, was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that makes a room go still, because everyone realizes the storm has already started. "With all due respect," she began softly, "mockery isn't a substitute for substance." The line landed without theatrics, but it carried weight. It wasn't rehearsed. It was truth spoken plainly. The room reacted instantly, not with noise, but with attention. Even the scribbling of reporters slowed down. Every eye shifted toward her, waiting for the rest. Crockett continued, her voice steady, measured, unshaken. "You can question my tone. You can question my delivery. That's your right. But what you won't do is confuse passion with ignorance, or conviction with chaos." There was no anger in her words, only precision. She wasn't defending herself. She was dissecting the behavior that had tried to belittle her. Mace's confident smirk wavered, just slightly, like glass under pressure. The audience began to sense a shift in gravity. Crockett wasn't answering an attack. She was redefining the entire conversation. What had started as a dismissal had become a lesson. You see, she went on, I've spent my career being told to calm down, to smile more, to make my truth softer so it's easier to hear. But here's the thing. The truth doesn't become less real just because it's uncomfortable. There it was, the crack in the debate. Mace tried to interject, her voice faltering between indignation and disbelief. No one's saying that, Congresswoman, but Crockett didn't stop. She didn't even raise her tone. She simply spoke through the interruption, her voice more commanding in its composure than any shout could ever be. Actually, that's exactly what's being said. Every time a woman in this chamber is told to watch her tone, to be less emotional, to make her strength more palatable. That's the message. The room froze. Even those who disagreed with her found themselves silent, not out of fear, but out of awe. There was something powerful about the way she framed her argument. She didn't make it personal. She made it universal. It wasn't just her versus Mace anymore. It was every woman who'd ever been told she was too much, standing quietly behind her. Mace leaned back, crossing her arms in a gesture that was supposed to look dismissive, but it only made her appear defensive. You're reading too much into this, she said, forcing a short laugh that didn't land. Crockett smiled faintly. Not mockery, but pity. Am I? She replied gently. Because every time I speak with conviction, someone tells me to calm down. Every time I stand firm, I'm told I'm being hostile. And every time I question the system, I'm told to be grateful I'm even in the room. That's not overreacting, that's observation. Her words hung in the air, perfectly balanced between restraint and revelation. The microphones didn't buzz, the cameras didn't move. They stayed locked on her face, the still center of a storm that was entirely her own making. Someone in the back of the room began to clap, quietly at first. It wasn't loud or showy, just a single person acknowledging the courage of speaking truth in a place built for performance. The clapping stopped almost as quickly as it began, but the echo lingered. Crockett leaned in closer to the microphone. Empathy doesn't mean silence, she said, her tone low but steady. And peace doesn't come from pretending everything's fine. You don't fix what you won't name. You don't heal what you refuse to see. The line hit like a quiet thunderclap. The audience inhaled collectively. Mace's gaze faltered. Not because she was defeated, but because she couldn't find footing in the truth being laid before her. Every attempt at sarcasm, every subtle jab, now looked small in comparison to Crockett's composure. And Crockett wasn't done. She leaned back now, reclaiming her space, every word deliberate. You can mock me, you can question me, but you will not define me. Because my voice, this tone you call too sharp, is the same voice that fights for people who never get a microphone at all. There was no need to raise her volume. The conviction was in her calm. The restraint became her weapon. The more quietly she spoke, the louder her truth sounded. A reporter typed rapidly, whispering under her breath, "This isn't just a response. This is a shift." The narrator would later describe it as the moment everything changed. She didn't answer to win. She answered to remind them what real leadership sounds like when it doesn't ask for permission. By the time Crockett finished, the tone of the room was unrecognizable. The laughter that had opened the exchange was gone. The smirks had faded. Even those who came in ready to disagree found themselves quietly reflecting. The only sound left was the faint hum of the microphones. Still recording, still witnessing. Crockett ended her statement not with flourish, but with grace. She looked directly at Mace and said simply, "Respect isn't about who speaks first. It's about who listens long enough to understand what's really being said." And then she stopped. No final insult, no dramatic gesture, just silence again. The kind that doesn't close a chapter but punctuates it. For a long moment, nobody moved. Mace's confidence had melted into unease. The audience sat frozen, processing what they had just heard. Crockett looked down at her notepad one last time, the same one she hadn't needed to use, and closed it gently. The camera stayed on her face as she turned slightly toward the audience, eyes calm, posture relaxed. She didn't need applause. The message had already landed. It was in that exact stillness that everyone understood. The debate hadn't ended because someone shouted louder. It ended because one woman refused to be silenced. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that rearranged the air. The kind that doesn't fill the room, but changes it. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they had just witnessed a turning point. Crockett had not raised her voice, yet somehow, her calm had echoed louder than any argument that day. But Nancy Mace, still smarting from losing control of the moment, wasn't ready to surrender the spotlight. She cleared her throat, the microphone amplifying the sound like thunder in the quiet. "Well," she began with a tight smile, "that was quite the speech." She emphasized the last word, letting sarcasm coat it like sugar hiding bitterness. "I think what we're all trying to get across here," she continued, "is that there's a difference between passion and professionalism, and maybe that's a line we need to be more careful about crossing." A few of her allies nodded along, but the approval was hesitant. The room wasn't with her anymore. It was watching, waiting. Crockett didn't respond immediately. She sat still, hands folded again, eyes unflinching. That calm composure that had once looked passive now radiated strength. Mace had fired another shot, but the bullet had no place to land. The tension rippled again. Cameras zoomed closer. The world beyond the hearing room, the journalists, the social media feeds, the political commentators, would later call this the collision point. Two women standing in the same fire but burning with different kinds of truth. Mace continued, her voice slightly sharper now. "I respect your conviction, Congresswoman," she said. "But sometimes conviction blinds us to reality. We all want justice, sure, but we can't let emotion cloud judgment." The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but they dripped with condescension. It was the same tone used to silence dissent while pretending to honor it. Crockett tilted her head slightly, a small, graceful motion, not in confusion, but in understanding. She knew what was happening. She'd seen this dance before, the polite diminishing of power, the performance of civility masking bias. When she finally spoke, her tone remained steady, but it carried something heavier. Truth forged through experience. "You talk about emotion as if it's a weakness," she began quietly, "but emotion is not the enemy of reason. It's the heartbeat of it. If we can't feel the impact of what we legislate, then maybe we shouldn't be legislating at all." The room went silent again. A low murmur ran through the audience, journalists exchanging glances, pens scratching across notepads faster than ever. Mace's face froze for half a second before she recovered, but it was too late. The shift had already happened. Crockett didn't stop there. She leaned forward, eyes clear and voice firm. "You say professionalism matters, and I agree. But professionalism without humanity becomes performance. It's easy to stay calm when you're comfortable. It's easy to talk about restraint when you've never had to fight to be heard. But for some of us, raising our voice isn't losing control. It's reclaiming it." Her words hit like precision strikes, each one direct, undeniable, and grounded in something deeper than politics. Truth. Mace opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, the Congresswoman who always had a clever line ready looked uncertain, as though the script she had prepared no longer fit the moment she was in. Across the room, a staffer whispered under his breath, "She flipped it completely," another replied. "Yeah." Mace started a debate. Crockett turned it into a reckoning, and they were right. What had begun as a power play was now something far more intimate, an exposure. Crockett wasn't arguing anymore. She was revealing. "You taught millions," she said, her gaze unwavering. "That confidence looks like control. But sometimes control is just fear dressed up as confidence." Mace blinked, taken aback. Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. "You mock my passion. But maybe the problem isn't my tone. Maybe it's that power finally sounds different. Maybe it's uncomfortable hearing strength that doesn't ask permission." The words landed like a quiet explosion. A few members of the audience started to clap before catching themselves. But it was too late. The moment had cracked open. The applause grew, scattered but sincere. It wasn't cheering for victory. It was release, acknowledgement, realization. Mace raised her hand slightly, signaling for order, but her voice no longer commanded the same authority. "We're not here for applause," she said stiffly. Crockett smiled, not smugly, not cruelly, but knowingly. "No," she replied softly. "We're here for accountability." The audience stilled again. Mace looked down at her notes, flipping pages she'd already read, as if searching for something to anchor her. But Crockett's words had already filled the space that her authority once occupied. The narrator's voice would later describe it perfectly. The crowd didn't clap for victory. They clapped because the air had changed. Crockett leaned back now, her body language relaxed but resolute. "You know," she continued, her tone softening slightly, "you can call it anger, you can call it attitude, you can even call it arrogance. But what I call it is survival. Every woman who's ever had to explain her existence twice before being heard knows what that means." Mace looked up again, this time without her trademark smirk. There was no retort, no quick remark, only silence. The kind of silence that comes not from defeat, but from recognition. Crockett's voice lowered even further, now almost a whisper, but it carried through every microphone and every heart in the room. "If truth makes people uncomfortable, that's not my problem. It's my purpose." And that was it. The collision of truths. One born of confidence, the other born of conviction. One built on control, the other on courage. The audience didn't know whether to applaud again or stay silent, so they did both. A strange, reverent hush, punctuated by the occasional soft clap. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the shift in energy. Crockett's expression softened. There was no arrogance, no triumph, just stillness and the kind that follows revelation. She wasn't speaking to Mace anymore. She was speaking to everyone who had ever watched power try to silence truth. "The thing about truth," she said in closing, "is that it doesn't wait for comfort. It doesn't bow to tone, and it doesn't whisper when it's finally free." She paused, letting the final line settle into the bones of the room. No music, no outro, no applause cue, just the echo of honesty cutting through decades of decorum. When the cameras zoomed out, you could see it, Mace looking down, Crockett sitting still, and an audience that had gone from spectators to witnesses. The debate was technically still in session, but everyone knew it was already over. Crockett had done what few could. She didn't just defend herself. She dismantled the very framework that tried to define her. And in doing so, she changed the temperature of the room, and maybe, just maybe, the tone of the entire conversation. When the hearing adjourned, the world outside the chamber didn't yet understand what had just happened. Inside, the energy had changed, the kind of change that doesn't come from noise, but from realization. A storm hadn't passed. It had been redirected. Reporters were already whispering into microphones, aides were gathering papers with shaky hands, and lawmakers were exchanging glances that said more than any headline could. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded. She had rewritten the tone of power. Nancy Mace walked out first, her usual confidence slightly dimmed, her stride still firm, but her expression unsettled. Cameras followed her, flashing in rapid bursts. "Congresswoman Mace," a journalist called out. "How do you respond to what happened in there?" Mace gave a tight smile, the kind reserved for damage control. "It was a lively debate," she said, brushing off the moment as politics as usual. But her voice didn't carry the same sharpness it had earlier. It was controlled. Maybe too controlled, like someone holding back more than she was willing to admit. Moments later, Jasmine Crockett emerged. The hallway erupted in noise, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, boom mics reaching forward like eager hands. She didn't hurry. She didn't perform. She just walked, calm, graceful, and unbothered. "Congresswoman Crockett," one reporter asked breathlessly, "how do you feel after that exchange?" She stopped briefly, turned toward the microphones, and smiled faintly. "I feel heard," she said simply. Then she walked away. That was the clip that went viral. Not the shouting, not the debate itself, but that single sentence delivered with composure. "I feel heard." Within hours, social media platforms exploded. The video spread across timelines like wildfire. On Twitter, her quotes trended under Jasmine Crockett vs. Mace, then Truth Doesn't Whisper. Every frame of the hearing was dissected, replayed, remixed. Some users created split-screen edits, Mace's mockery on one side, Crockett's calm rebuttal on the other, a study in contrast between provocation and poise. Others added captions. "This is what composure looks like when power tries to belittle you." Commentators rushed to fill the airwaves. On one network, a conservative analyst defended Mace's remarks as spirited debate, insisting the reaction online was overblown. But on another channel, a panel of women, journalists, activists, and political veterans, praised Crockett's restraint. One said she didn't just win the argument. She exposed the double standard that's been in politics forever. And they were right. The country wasn't talking about policy anymore. They were talking about tone, about respect, about what it means to be both passionate and professional as a woman in power. The confrontation had become something larger, a cultural mirror. TikTok turned the moment into a movement. Users stitched Crockett's words. Empathy doesn't mean silence. Peace doesn't come from pretending everything's fine. Into thousands of short videos. Teachers, lawyers, nurses, mothers. Women from every background repeated her lines in front of cameras, using her voice to tell their own stories. It was more than a viral soundbite. It was catharsis. But for every voice cheering her on, there were others trying to pull her down. Critics labeled her response performative, divisive, too emotional. Some accused her of playing the victim. Others said she overreacted. The same old words resurfaced, coded, familiar and predictable. Yet none of it seemed to stick. Every time someone tried to discredit her, another clip surfaced, showing just how measured, composed, and factual she had been. Meanwhile, political podcasts lit up with analysis. One commentator summed it up best. Mace came to win a debate. Crockett came to change the tone of the room, and she did. That night, every major news outlet played the clip. Headlines flashed across screens. Jasmine Crockett's calm destroys mockery. Nancy Mace's sarcasm backfires in heated exchange. When truth speaks softly, the room listens. The next morning, opinion pieces filled newspapers. Some praised Crockett for her poise, calling her the new face of composed defiance. Others warned that social media is turning political moments into entertainment. But whether people loved it or hated it, they were talking, and that was power in itself. In offices, cafes, and classrooms, people debated what had happened. Some saw Mace as a seasoned politician holding her ground. Others saw Crockett as a mirror, reflecting everything that still needed to change. But the universal truth was this: everyone had felt something when they watched it. At home, Crockett sat in her living room long after the news cycle ended. Her phone buzzed endlessly, texts, notifications, interview requests. But she didn't rush to respond. She just watched the replay once quietly. The camera had caught everything: the silence, the restraint, the precision. She smiled faintly and shook her head. "They finally heard me," she whispered. Across town, Mace sat in her office, scrolling through headlines. The more she read, the more she realized how differently people had interpreted the same moment. To her, it had been another exchange. To everyone else, it had been revelation. She wasn't angry, not exactly. She was unsettled. The woman she'd tried to mock had managed to turn her own arrogance into a reflection of something larger. In the following days, the moment continued to ripple through public consciousness. Late-night hosts mentioned it in their monologues. Activists quoted Crockett in speeches. Even high school debate teams analyzed the confrontation as a study in rhetorical strategy. But the most striking part wasn't the noise. It was the quiet aftermath. The video didn't fade like most viral moments do. It lingered, replayed, reinterpreted, remembered. People didn't just share it. They felt it. For women in politics, it became a symbol. Proof that strength doesn't have to shout to be powerful. For others, it was a lesson in emotional intelligence under fire. And then came the quote, the one that outlived the headlines. The goal was never to win the argument. It was to remind the world that truth doesn't whisper when it's finally free. Those words, spoken softly at the end of the hearing, became a digital mantra. Artists turned them into typography posters. Activists printed them on shirts and tote bags. Journalists cited them in op-eds about dignity, leadership, and gender in politics. The irony, of course, was that Mace's mockery, meant to humiliate, had amplified Crockett's voice louder than any speech could have. The debate wasn't remembered for its policy points, or even for who won. It was remembered because a woman chose stillness over shouting, conviction over combat, grace over gamesmanship. Weeks later, a new congressional session began. The same room, the same lights, the same rows of desks, but something in the air had shifted. The echoes of that moment still lingered. People were quieter, more careful with their tone, more aware of their words. When Crockett entered the chamber that day, she didn't walk like someone who had gone viral. She walked like someone who had made history in a small but undeniable way. Colleagues nodded to her with a respect that hadn't been there before. Even Mace, sitting a few rows away, gave a brief nod, subtle, almost imperceptible, but genuine. The narrator would later describe this aftermath in poetic simplicity. It wasn't the confrontation that went viral. It was the calm after it, the silence that didn't end the debate, but made the world listen differently. And that was the truth of it, the echo. Long after the lights dimmed, long after the headlines moved on, the moment kept reverberating, not because it was loud, but because it was real. The world had watched two women clash, but what stayed wasn't the clash. It was the quiet courage that followed. Proof that sometimes, the most powerful sound in politics is the sound of someone finally being heard. The studio lights had dimmed, but the echo of what had unfolded still lingered like electricity in the air. The audience wasn't breathing in sync anymore. They were suspended, caught between awe and silence. What they had witnessed wasn't just a political confrontation. It was something human, something unfiltered. The air felt different now. Heavy, sacred almost, as if truth itself had taken up residence in the room. Oprah sat still in her chair. For the first time in what felt like hours, she didn't have another question, another word, another guiding phrase. Her eyes glistened, not with defeat, but with recognition. She had seen hundreds of interviews, thousands of emotions, but this one was different. Jasmine Crockett hadn't played the game. She had redefined it. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile in triumph or bask in validation. Her face was calm, grounded, the look of someone who had carried her truth for so long that finally speaking it wasn't victory, but release. The audience sat transfixed. You could feel it. That shared understanding that something rare had just happened. For a long, delicate pause, no one said a word. The cameras kept rolling, waiting for Oprah to reclaim the rhythm of the conversation, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back slightly, eyes soft but full, and simply nodded. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement. That nod said everything. Crockett took a small breath, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. The goal was never to win the argument, she said. It was to remind the world that truth doesn't whisper when it's finally free. Those words, measured, final, and breathtakingly honest, seemed to ripple through the air like a slow-moving wave. The audience didn't erupt into applause immediately. They sat in reverent silence, as if applause would cheapen the weight of what had just been said. A few people blinked back tears. Others simply nodded in silent agreement. Then slowly the clapping began, not explosive, not chaotic, but rising in rhythm, wave by wave, until the entire room was on its feet. Oprah stood too, quietly, and extended her hand across the space between them. Crockett met it, and for that fleeting moment, two women, different in background, belief and path, shared something wordless yet profound: respect, recognition, a mutual understanding that this wasn't about politics or ego. It was about the power of truth spoken fearlessly. As the applause continued, Crockett turned slightly toward the audience. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes softened. The strength that had carried her through the debate now looked like serenity. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence said it for her. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. They knew they had captured something timeless. Not a clip that would go viral for controversy, but a moment that would echo for meaning. the kind that would be replayed years later as a reminder of what authenticity looks like in a world addicted to performance. When the show ended, people didn't rush to leave. They lingered. Even the crew, usually quick to dismantle the set, moved slower than usual, as if they too didn't want to disturb the stillness. Oprah and Crockett exchanged a final nod before walking off opposite sides of the stage, but somehow it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a passing of light. From one woman who had spent decades helping others find their voices, to another who had just used hers to shake the world. Outside, the media waited, eager for statements, sound bites, anything, but both women declined to speak. There was nothing left to add. The internet would carry the rest, the quotes, the reactions, the endless breakdowns of what had been said and what it meant. But those who had been in that room knew. No analysis could capture the feeling of witnessing that truth in real time. By morning, clips of the exchange had already taken over social platforms. But the tone was different this time. It wasn't outrage or chaos. It was reflection. Comment sections filled with words like grace, truth, power, and healing. People weren't arguing about who was right anymore. They were talking about why it had mattered. One tweet captured the sentiment perfectly. When truth is spoken without anger, it shakes louder than a scream. Crockett didn't post a victory statement. She didn't need to. Her final line had already become a mantra, a whisper spreading like wildfire. Truth doesn't whisper when it's finally free. The following week, an editorial in The Atlantic described the moment as a cultural pivot, the rare intersection of politics and poetry. Another commentator called it the kind of dialogue that reminds us why words still matter. But beyond the think pieces and trending hashtags, the legacy of that night lived in smaller spaces. A high school teacher played the clip for her debate class, telling her students, "This is what composure looks like." A young woman running for local office watched it before her first campaign speech, drawing courage from Crockett's stillness. Even in congressional halls, where noise often drowns meaning, lawmakers reference the exchange as a reminder that grace can be as powerful as grit. And somewhere, far from the cameras, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in her home. No entourage, no press, just her and the quiet hum of her thoughts. She replayed the moment once in her mind, not with pride, but with peace. For the first time in a long while, she felt the rare satisfaction of having said exactly what she needed to say. No more, no less. The narrator's voice fades in over a slow cinematic shot of that same stage. Now empty, lights dimmed. And just like that, the conversation was over, but the echo had only begun. In the stillness of that final frame, the audience isn't watching Crockett or Mace or even Oprah anymore. They're watching themselves, reflecting on the truth that, sometimes, the most radical thing a person can do is speak softly and still be heard. Because the moment wasn't about who won. It wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about liberation. The quiet, unstoppable force of authenticity cutting through pretense. And long after the applause faded, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the echo remained. It lived not in the sound, but in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that doesn't end a story, but carries it forward into history.